in the glittering heart of London, where fortunes are made and reputations are shattered with a single whisper, a desperate young woman attended a ball she never should have. Her only goal was to fade into the tapestries, to witness what she must, and then vanish before her presence brought ruin upon her family. But in a world choreographed by power and propriety, one misstep can change everything. As she fled the suffocating opulence, her desperate escape was cut short. She didn't collide with a servant or a minor lord. She stumbled directly into the unyielding arms of a man so powerful, so cold, they called him the Winter Duke, a man who never touched anyone, and who was about to unravel a secret she would die to protect. Gaslight rained down from a dozen crystal chandeliers, catching on the diamonds that glittered at the throats of London's high society, and turning the ballroom of Landon House into a constellation of earthly stars. Every corner of the vast chamber hummed with the calculated murmur of gossip, the rustle of silk gowns, and the soaring notes of a string quartet. For most of the young ladies present, this was the pinnacle of existence, a marketplace of matrimony, where a well-executed curtsy or a perfectly timed smile could secure a title and a fortune. For Miss Cordelia Ainsworth, it was a prison crafted from gold leaf and suffocating perfume. She stood near a marble column, partially obscured by a monstrous fern, her gloved fingers clutching a small empty glass of lemonade. Her gown, a simple dove-grey muslin, was a whisper in a room of shouting jewel tones. It was clean, respectable, and utterly invisible, precisely the effect she had hoped for. She was not here as a guest, not truly. She was the shadow of her cousin, Caroline, a flighty, beautiful girl whose parents had paid a handsome sum for Cordelia to act as her companion for the season. The sum was handsome enough to keep Cordelia's own mother and younger sister from the brink of destitution for another year. That thought, and that thought alone, kept her feet rooted to the polished floor. Her task was simple: ensure Caroline did not make a fool of herself, discourage any unsuitable suitors, and steer her towards the dull but obscenely wealthy Baron Ashworth. It was a task that required the strategic mind of a general and the stealth of a cat burglar. Tonight, however, Caroline had been successfully cornered by the Baron near the refreshment table, and Cordelia had been granted a brief, blessed reprieve. She used the moment not to socialize, but to observe, her mind a ledger of every slight, every alliance, every predatory gaze that swept the room. Her eyes, a shade of mossy green that often seemed too serious for her 20 years, scanned the crowd. She saw Lady Henrietta Finch, a diamond of the first water, holding court with a flock of admirers, her laughter as sharp and brilliant as the jewels she wore. She saw Lord Percival, already too deep in his cups, and the formidable Duchess of Sutherland, whose regal disapproval could curdle milk from 50 paces. And then she saw him. He stood apart from the throng, a solitary island of formidable stillness. Alaric Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. Even from across the room, his presence was a physical force, drawing the eye and silencing whispers in his immediate vicinity. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his black tailcoat tailored to perfection, offering no hint of flamboyance. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, and his profile, which was all Cordelia could see, was a study in aristocratic severity. A straight nose, a firm jaw, a mouth that looked as if it had never formed a genuine smile. They called him the Winter Duke, not just for his vast, cold estates in the north, but for the man himself. Stories about him were traded like currency among the ton. They said he had a heart of ice, that he had never been seen to laugh, that his courtesy was a blade, and his silence a condemnation. He had inherited his title 5 years prior, after the tragic death of his parents, and had since managed his vast fortune with a terrifying and ruthless efficiency, doubling its value while freezing out all but the most necessary of social connections. He was the greatest catch of the season, and also the most impossible. Cordelia shivered, despite the warmth of the room. A man like that was a predator. He would see a woman like her, a woman with a precarious foothold in this world, and would not even register her existence. And that was for the best. Her family name, Ainsworth, was once respectable, but a shadow of scandal from her father's generation still clung to it, a faint stain that made them undesirable in circles such as these. Her presence here was a risk, a gamble on the short memory of the aristocracy. All she had to do was remain unseen. A sudden shift in the crowd broke her reverie. Caroline was fluttering her fan and giggling, having successfully detached herself from the Baron. She was now heading towards a group of young, rakish officers, her eyes sparkling with a dangerous mischief that sent a bolt of panic through Cordelia's chest. That was her cue. She had to intercept her cousin before she undid an entire evening's work. Setting her glass down on a nearby table, Cordelia began to move. She kept to the edges of the room, a grey mouse skirting the gilded wainscoting. She slipped behind a knot of gossiping dowagers, their powdered faces turning towards her with mild curiosity, before dismissing her as unimportant. She squeezed past a portly gentleman pontificating on the corn laws. She was almost there, almost within reach of Caroline's shimmering pink silks, when Lady Henrietta Finch stepped directly into her path. "Watch where you are going," Lady Henrietta snapped, her voice low but laced with venom. She hadn't even looked at Cordelia, her eyes fixed on the Duke of Blackwood across the room. But she had felt the minor inconvenience of another person's presence. Cordelia murmured an apology, her face flushing with heat. The momentary delay was catastrophic. Caroline had reached the officers and was already accepting a glass of champagne, her laughter ringing out, a little too loud, a little too free. Cordelia's heart sank. She had failed. The shame was a hot, physical thing, pressing on her chest. All she wanted was to disappear, to flee the lights, the music, the hundreds of judging eyes. She turned, abandoning her mission for a new one: immediate escape. There was a side door near the musician's alcove that led to a small, secluded terrace. If she could just reach it, she could breathe. She could gather her wits before plunging back into the fray. She hurried her steps, her gaze fixed on the door, a beacon of hope in the overwhelming sea of society. She didn't see the figure who had turned away from his solitary post. She didn't see the dark, imposing form that moved with a silent, purposeful grace. She was a breath away from the door, her hand outstretched, when she walked directly into something as solid and unyielding as a brick wall. A gasp was stolen from her lungs. She stumbled backward, her balance lost. Strong hands shot out, gripping her upper arms with a firm, steadying pressure that was both a shock and a salvation. Her head snapped up, her apology dying on her lips as she found herself staring up into the coldest, clearest pair of blue eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of a winter sky, stark and piercing, and they belonged to the one man in the room she had prayed to avoid. Alaric Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, was looking down at her, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. And in that terrifying, silent moment, Cordelia Ainsworth knew her desperate attempt to remain unseen had just failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The Duke's hands on her arms were a brand of heat through the thin fabric of her gloves and sleeves. For a heart-stopping second, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The music of the string quartet faded to a distant hum, and the cacophony of the ballroom receded. All Cordelia was aware of was the sheer, imposing presence of the man holding her, and the intense, analytical scrutiny of his gaze. His eyes, she thought with a strange sense of detachment, were not just cold. They were profound, like the depths of a frozen lake, hinting at something ancient and still beneath the surface. There was no flicker of anger or annoyance in them, merely a chillingly remote assessment. He looked at her not as a woman, but as an unexpected obstacle, a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in his path. "My Lord Duke," she stammered, finding her voice at last. It came out as a breathless whisper. She tried to pull away, but his grip remained firm, anchoring her in place. "Forgive me. I was not watching my path." The Duke of Blackwood didn't release her. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, sweeping over her simple grey gown, her unadorned hair, her flushed face, before returning to her eyes, a muscle feathered in his sharp jaw. "Evidently," he said. His voice was exactly as she would have imagined it, deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, final and absolute. He seemed to be waiting for something more, but Cordelia's mind had gone entirely blank. All the pretty, rehearsed phrases of polite society had deserted her. She was acutely aware of how they must look, the most powerful, sought-after man in the room, holding a nobody in the middle of the floor. Already, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere around them. The murmur of conversation had lulled, and curious eyes were turning in their direction. A hot wave of mortification washed over her. This was 1,000 times worse than Caroline's flirtations. This was a spectacle, and she was at its center. "If you would be so kind as to release me, Your Grace," she managed, her voice gaining a sliver of composure. She tilted her chin up, refusing to cower under his intimidating stare. "I would not wish to detain you." A flicker of something, was it surprise, passed through his glacial eyes. He had likely expected tears or a flustered apology, not a direct if polite demand. For a moment, she thought he would refuse, that he would hold her there simply to prove that he could. Then, just as abruptly as he had caught her, he let go. Cordelia took a hasty step back, rubbing her arms as if to erase the lingering sensation of his touch. She risked a glance around the room, and her heart plummeted. Lady Henrietta Finch was now staring at them, her beautiful face a mask of pure fury, her fan snapping shut with an audible crack. Cordelia had not just collided with the Duke. She had inadvertently trespassed on territory, Lady Henrietta considered exclusively her own. "Alaric, there you are." Lady Henrietta's voice sliced through the air as she glided towards them, her scarlet silk gown a slash of colour against the more muted tones of the ballroom. "I was just telling Lord Ashworth that you promised me the next waltz." It was a blatant lie, and everyone knew it. The Duke of Blackwood didn't dance, but it was a power play, a public reclaiming of her prize. Her eyes, the colour of hard brown sherry, flicked over Cordelia in a dismissive glance that took in her cheap muslin and lack of jewels, and branded her as less than nothing. The Duke turned his head slowly to face her. "I believe you are mistaken, Lady Henrietta," he said, his tone unchanging. He had not raised his voice, yet the dismissal was so absolute it was like a slap. Lady Henrietta's smile tightened, but she was not so easily deterred. "Oh, you are such a dreadful tease," she purred, placing a proprietary hand on his arm. "Don't tell me you were allowing yourself to be distracted by this." Her gesture towards Cordelia was infinitesimally small, but it dripped with contempt. Cordelia felt her blood run cold, then hot. She was a ghost, a shadow, but she would not be insulted. Years of swallowing pride, of enduring the condescension of her employers, of biting her tongue for the sake of her family's survival, coalesced into a single spark of defiance. Before she could think better of it, she spoke. "The Duke was not distracted, my lady. He was kind enough to prevent my fall after I was jostled in your direction." She met Lady Henrietta's glare without flinching. The lie was subtle, but it shifted the blame, painting Henrietta's own movement as the cause of the disturbance. Lady Henrietta's eyes widened in disbelief, her perfectly painted lips parting in a silent gasp of outrage. No one, least of all a dowdy companion, spoke to her with such impertinence. But it was the Duke's reaction that was most startling. He had turned his head slightly, and though his expression remained impassive, Cordelia saw it again. That minute flicker in his eyes. This time, it looked almost like amusement. A ghost of an expression, there and gone in an instant, but she had seen it. He said nothing, offering neither confirmation nor denial of Cordelia's statement. His silence was a weapon, and he wielded it with masterful precision, leaving the two women in a standoff. He simply watched, his unnerving gaze moving from Cordelia's defiant face to Lady Henrietta's sputtering indignation. The tension was broken by the frantic arrival of Caroline, her face flushed with champagne and excitement. "Cordelia, there you are! I have the most wonderful news. Lieutenant Abernathy has invited us to watch the regatta from his uncle's yacht." Cordelia closed her eyes for a brief second. A yacht, with a penniless lieutenant. It was the exact opposite of their mission. "Caroline, we must speak," she said through gritted teeth. She used her cousin's arrival as a lifeline. Curtsying stiffly to the Duke, a gesture that encompassed both respect and dismissal, she said, "Your Grace, Lady Henrietta." She took Caroline's arm in a firm grip and began to steer her away, desperate to melt back into the anonymity of the crowd. "Wait." The single word, spoken in that low, commanding tone, stopped her dead. It was not a request. Cordelia turned back slowly. The Duke of Blackwood's eyes were fixed on her, and the unnerving feeling of being analyzed had intensified. "Your Grace." He took a step forward, ignoring Lady Henrietta completely. He was so close now that she could see the fine weave of his black coat, the stark white of his cravat, and the almost imperceptible silver flecks in his winter blue eyes. "You haven't told me your name," he stated. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Cordelia. To give him her name was to give him a thread to pull, a way to find her, to uncover the precariousness of her position and the stain on her family's past. Her instinct, her every self-preservation nerve, screamed at her to lie, to invent a name, to do anything but give him the truth. But to lie to a duke, to this duke, was a folly of an entirely different magnitude. "It is Ainsworth, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely audible. "Miss Cordelia Ainsworth." He held her gaze for a moment longer, a look of intense, unreadable concentration on his face, as if he were committing the name to memory, filing it away in some cold, ordered chamber of his mind. "Ainsworth," he repeated softly, the name a strange, unfamiliar sound on his lips. Then with a curt, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked away, leaving Cordelia standing in the middle of the ballroom with her panicked cousin and a fuming Lady Henrietta, the weight of his attention settling upon her like a shroud. Cordelia managed to drag Caroline away from the officers, and, after a hissed lecture on the vital importance of Baron Ashworth's continued interest, deposited her back at the Baron's side. Her cousin, suitably chastened and slightly sobered, was thankfully docile for the remainder of the evening. Cordelia, however, could not regain her composure. She felt as though a spotlight had been fixed upon her, illuminating every flaw, every threadbare patch in her carefully constructed invisibility. She could feel the stares, the whispered questions that followed in her wake. Who was that girl? The one who ran into Blackwood. An Ainsworth, did you say? Which Ainsworths? She retreated once more to the shadows of the ballroom, but there was no safety there. The Duke's attention had made her visible, and visibility was danger. She saw him once more before the night ended. He was standing with a group of stern-faced, important-looking men, likely members of Parliament, discussing matters of state. Yet, as she watched from behind the safety of a floral arrangement, his gaze lifted, sweeping the room with an unnerving precision before landing directly on her. He did not smile or nod. He simply looked, his expression as remote as ever, but the contact was as tangible as a physical touch. He knew she was there. He was watching her. A chill traced its way down her spine. The carriage ride home with Caroline and her aunt, Mrs. Pembroke, was an ordeal. Caroline chattered endlessly about Lieutenant Abernathy's dashing uniform, while her aunt complained about the weakness of the punch. Cordelia said little. The Duke's name, Ainsworth, still echoing in her mind. The following days were a torment of anxiety. Every knock at the door sent her heart leaping into her throat. Every formal calling card delivered on a silver tray made her palms sweat. She expected, she knew not what. A dismissal from her post for her impertinence. A cutting remark from Lady Henrietta delivered via a third party. Or, most terrifyingly, some form of communication from the Duke himself. But nothing came. The silence was in some ways more unnerving than an open confrontation. It allowed her imagination to run wild. At a morning music hall 2 days later, she overheard two ladies discussing the Landon House ball. "Did you see him?" one whispered behind her fan. "The Duke of Blackwood. He actually spoke to someone. Some little grey mouse of a girl." "I heard Henrietta Finch was practically spitting fire," the other replied with a gleeful hiss. "She's been stalking him all season. For him to notice a nobody. It's a delicious scandal." Cordelia felt her cheeks burn. A delicious scandal. She was sport for these people. That afternoon, she received an unexpected summons. Not from the Duke, but from a man she had hoped never to encounter again. Lord Harrington was waiting for her in the Pembrokes' rarely used morning room. He was a man of middling years, with a handsome but dissipated face, a cruel set to his mouth, and eyes that held a knowing, unpleasant gleam. He was an old acquaintance of the Pembroke family, but more importantly, he was the son of the man who had been instrumental in her own family's ruin. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, rising as she entered. He dispensed with any pleasantries. "I trust you are enjoying the season." "Lord Harrington," she replied coolly, curtsying as required. "It is a surprise to see you." "I am an old friend of the family," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I make it a point to check in, especially when I hear interesting little tidbits of gossip." Cordelia's stomach tightened. "I am not one for gossip, my lord." "Oh, but gossip is so often one for you," he countered, stepping closer. "It has reached my ears that you have made an impression on the Duke of Blackwood." She remained silent, her expression carefully neutral. A dangerous man to attract, Miss Ainsworth. Very dangerous. He is not known for his gentle inclinations. A man like that, with his power, can be a great friend or a devastating enemy. He digs into things. He uncovers secrets that are best left buried. He let the words hang in the air, a clear and potent threat. Cordelia knew what he was referring to. The official story of her family's downfall was that her father, a land steward for a wealthy marquess, had been caught embezzling a fortune. He had died of a fever in debtor's prison before he could clear his name, leaving his family destitute and disgraced. Lord Harrington's father had been the primary witness against him, but Cordelia knew the truth. Her father had been an honest man, framed by Harrington Sr. and his cronies to cover their own crimes. "I have no secrets to uncover, my lord," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. "Don't you?" Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Everyone has secrets. A family's disgrace, a precarious financial situation, the desperate measures a young woman might take to keep her mother and sister off the streets. All it would take is a word in the right ear, the Duke's ear, perhaps, and your cousin's advantageous match would evaporate. Your employment would end, and your family would be left with nothing." Again. The cruelty of it stole her breath. He was using her family's pain as a weapon against her. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "For now, simply for you to remember your place. You are a companion, a servant. You do not catch the eyes of dukes, discourage his interest. If he attempts to see you again, you will refuse. Is that understood?" She could only nod, a wave of helpless fury washing over her. She was trapped by her poverty, by her past, and now by this odious man who held her future in his hands. Lord Harrington smiled, satisfied. "Excellent. I am glad we had this little chat." He bowed mockingly and left the room, leaving Cordelia trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. His warning solidified her resolve. She had to avoid the Duke of Blackwood at all costs. The risk was too great. The whispers were one thing. The explicit threat from Lord Harrington was another entirely. He could and would ruin them. Her resolve was tested less than 24 hours later. A footman, his face a mask of polite bewilderment, entered the drawing room where Cordelia was mending one of Caroline's lace shawls. He carried a heavy cream envelope on a silver tray. "For you, Miss Ainsworth," he announced, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic awe. Cordelia's needle froze mid-stitch. She looked up and saw the ducal crest pressed into the dark blue wax seal, the symbol of the House of Blackwood. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she took the envelope. Mrs. Pembroke and Caroline stopped their conversation, their eyes wide with astonishment. Breaking the seal, Cordelia unfolded the thick, expensive paper. The handwriting was bold and black, the lines sharp and decisive. It was not a letter. It was an invitation. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, requests the pleasure of the company of Mrs. Pembroke, Miss Pembroke, and Miss Ainsworth for a luncheon and tour of the gardens at Blackwood Manor. A direct invitation. To his home. And he had named her specifically. Miss Ainsworth. It was not a casual inclusion of the companion. It was the entire point of the summons. It was a calculated, deliberate move, a royal command disguised as a polite request. "Good heavens," Mrs. Pembroke breathed, snatching the invitation from Cordelia's nerveless fingers. "Blackwood Manor. Caroline, do you understand what this means?" Caroline was staring at Cordelia, her blue eyes filled with a mixture of envy and confusion. "But why, Cordelia?" It was the question that screamed in Cordelia's own mind. "Why?" He was the Winter Duke. He did not issue casual invitations. Every move he made was said to have a purpose. What purpose could he possibly have with her? Lord Harrington's threat echoed in her ears. "If he attempts to see you again, you will refuse." But how could she? To refuse a direct invitation from a Duke of Alaric Beaumont's stature was a social slight of the highest order. It would be an insult not just to him, but to her employers, the Pembrokes. It would be remarked upon, questioned. It would draw far more attention than accepting. She was caught in a beautifully crafted trap. To accept was to defy Lord Harrington and risk exposure. To refuse was to commit social suicide and invite suspicion from the Duke himself. Standing there in the chintz-filled drawing room, the heavy weight of the invitation in her hands, Cordelia felt a profound sense of dread. The Duke of Blackwood was not a man who forgot or forgave. He was pulling a thread, and she had no choice but to let him, knowing with a terrible certainty that it was attached to the one thing she could not afford to have unravel: the truth. The carriage that arrived to collect them was not the Pembrokes' modest vehicle, but one dispatched from the Duke's own mews. It was a testament to his power and wealth, a gleaming black lacquered coach with the Blackwood crest emblazoned on the door in subtle silver. The horses were a perfectly matched pair of greys, their harnesses jingling with a quiet, expensive music. The entire conveyance spoke of precision, order, and an utter disregard for expense. It was, Cordelia thought, as the footman helped her inside, a perfect reflection of its owner. The journey to Blackwood Manor, located on the fashionable outskirts of London, was tense. Mrs. Pembroke issued a constant stream of instructions to Caroline on etiquette, while Caroline herself kept shooting speculative glances at Cordelia, her expression a potent cocktail of resentment and curiosity. Cordelia, for her part, remained silent, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had spent the last 2 days in a state of quiet panic, her mind replaying Lord Harrington's threats on a loop. By accepting the invitation, she had chosen her poison. Defying Harrington was a terrifying gamble, but snubbing the Duke seemed an even faster route to ruin. Her only hope was to be as dull, as unremarkable as possible during the luncheon. She would be polite, quiet, and utterly forgettable. Blackwood Manor rose into view, and Cordelia's breath caught in her throat. It was not a manor so much as a palace, a formidable structure of pale grey stone that commanded the landscape. It was starkly beautiful, built along severe classical lines, with none of the frivolous ornamentation popular in more modern architecture. The grounds were immaculate, the gardens laid out with a geometric precision that was impressive rather than welcoming. It was a fortress, a bastion of power, and it radiated the same cold, imposing aura as the Duke himself. They were greeted at the door by a butler who moved with the silent efficiency of a phantom. He led them through a grand hall of marble and shadow, where the only sounds were the echo of their own footsteps and the ticking of a colossal grandfather clock. Portraits of past Beaumonts, all possessing the same severe jawline and piercing eyes as the current Duke, watched their progress from the walls. They found their host in a vast, light-filled salon that overlooked the gardens. The room was furnished with an austere elegance: dark wood, rich velvets in shades of navy, and forest green, and not a single frivolous object in sight. Alaric Beaumont stood by the tall French windows, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. He turned as they were announced, and the full force of his presence seemed to suck the air from the room. "Mrs. Pembroke, Miss Pembroke," he said, his voice a low, formal rumble. He inclined his head in their direction. Then his eyes, those chips of winter sky, moved and settled on Cordelia. "Miss Ainsworth, thank you for coming." The direct address, the specific thanks, immediately shattered Cordelia's plan to be invisible. It singled her out, placing her once again at the center of his attention. Mrs. Pembroke and Caroline both stiffened, their surprise palpable. Luncheon was a masterclass in controlled, agonizing tension. The food was exquisite, served on porcelain so fine Cordelia feared it might shatter at her touch, but she could barely taste it. The Duke was a strangely compelling host. He did not engage in the light, meaningless chatter that was the lifeblood of society gatherings. Instead, he directed the conversation with pointed, intelligent questions. He spoke with Mrs. Pembroke about her charitable committees and with Caroline about her watercolors. his inquiries so perceptive that both women were left slightly flustered, unused to having their trivial pastimes taken so seriously. But his focus, she soon realized, was on her. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, fixing her with his disconcerting gaze across the polished expanse of the dining table. "Mrs. Pembroke informs me that you are widely read. Who is your preferred poet?" The question was unexpected. She had anticipated queries about her family or her duties, not her literary tastes. I find myself drawn to the works of Mr. Wordsworth, Your Grace," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "His perspective on nature is one I find deeply moving." "Indeed," the Duke replied. "Many find solace in the romantic depiction of a nature that is benevolent and picturesque. I, however, find Lord Byron's realism more compelling. He acknowledges that nature, like man, possesses a capacity for both sublime beauty and brutal indifference." His eyes held hers, and she felt as if they were having an entirely different conversation, one about philosophy and the harsh realities of the world, hidden beneath the guise of literary debate. He was testing her, she realized. He was probing the edges of her mind, looking for something. After the meal, he led them on the promised tour of the gardens, while Mrs. Pembroke and Caroline exclaimed over the rare blooms in the hothouse. The Duke deliberately fell into step beside Cordelia as they walked along a secluded gravel path bordered by a high yew hedge. "You seem ill at ease, Miss Ainsworth," he observed, his voice pitched low enough that the others could not hear. "The grandeur of your home is rather overwhelming, Your Grace," she replied, seizing the easy excuse. "Is it the grandeur that overwhelms you, or the man who owns it?" The question was direct, stripping away her pretense. Cordelia stopped walking and turned to face him. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling his severe features in light and shadow. "You are a duke, my lord. I am a paid companion. Forgive me if I find our present situation somewhat unusual." "I find it unusual as well," he admitted, his expression unreadable. "I do not typically issue such invitations, but our encounter at Landon House, it left me with a question." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. "A question, Your Grace?" "Your name," he said, his gaze intensifying. "Ainsworth. It is not a common name in society these days, yet I have a memory of it, from a long time ago, a connection to my own family." A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over her. This was far worse than she had imagined. He wasn't pursuing her because of some fleeting attraction. He was pursuing a memory, a loose thread from his past that she was tangled in, a past that involved the ruin of her family. "I cannot imagine how, Your Grace," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "My family has lived in quiet obscurity for many years." "Perhaps." He did not sound convinced. His eyes dropped from her face to her throat. Cordelia instinctively raised a hand to the base of her neck. Tucked beneath the modest high collar of her dress, resting against her skin, was the one valuable possession she owned, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. It had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that. It was so worn with age that the intricate engravings on its surface were almost smooth. She always wore it. It was a connection to the life and the father she had lost. In her haste and nervousness that day, she must have forgotten to ensure it was completely hidden. A tiny sliver of the silver chain must have been visible. The Duke's expression, for the first time since she had met him, shifted. The remote, icy control faltered, replaced by a look of stark, utter shock. His blue eyes widened, fixed on that tiny point at her collar. He took a half-step closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, raw whisper that was more shocking than any shout. "That locket," he said, his voice tight with some powerful, suppressed emotion. "Where did you get it?" Cordelia froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She felt dizzy, the manicured garden seeming to tilt around her. He knew. He recognized it. The Duke of Blackwood, the coldest man in England, looked at her as if he had just seen a ghost. "That locket," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "It belonged to my mother." The world tilted on its axis. The carefully tended roses, the distant chatter of Caroline and her aunt, the warm afternoon sun. It all receded, replaced by the deafening roar of panic in Cordelia's ears. His mother's locket. The words were an indictment, a death sentence to the fragile peace she had tried to build. The locket was her most cherished possession, a tangible link to a past she both mourned and feared. And now it was the very thing that would expose her. Her hand flew to her throat, her fingers closing protectively over the thin fabric of her dress, shielding the locket from his sight. "You are mistaken, Your Grace," she managed to say, her voice thin and reedy. "This was my mother's. It has been in my family for generations." "Do not lie to me," he bit out, the words sharp as shards of ice. The mask of ducal indifference had shattered completely, revealing a raw, intense emotion beneath. His eyes burned with a cold fire she had not thought possible. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he loomed over her, his shadow falling across her like a judgment. The yew hedge on one side and his formidable frame on the other created a cage, trapping her with the terrible weight of his question. "My mother, the late Duchess, never went anywhere without it," he continued, his voice a low, ragged thing. "It was a unique design, commissioned for her by my father. There is not another like it in all of England. It vanished the year she died. Tell me how a companion, a Miss Ainsworth, comes to be in possession of the stolen property of the Duchess of Blackwood." Stolen. The word was a physical blow. Her mind raced, desperately seeking an escape, an explanation that would not condemn her. But there was none. The truth was her only path, and it was a path that led directly through the heart of the scandal that had destroyed her family. "It was not stolen," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the gravel at her feet. "It was a gift." "A gift?" he scoffed, the sound harsh and disbelieving. "The Duchess did not bestow £1,000 lockets upon the daughters of provincial stewards." His words, meant to be a scornful dismissal, inadvertently provided her with the opening she needed. Her head snapped up, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of defensive pride for her father. "You remember him, then?" she challenged, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You remember John Ainsworth?" Alaric's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. The look on his face was complex, a mixture of anger, confusion, and a dawning, unwelcome recognition. "I remember the name. He was a steward employed by the Marquis of Pembroke. He was accused of theft. A great scandal." "He was my father," Cordelia stated, the words tasting of ash in her mouth. "And he was an honest man. He was framed." The Duke stared at her, his piercing blue eyes searching her face, weighing her words. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the buzz of a bee nearby. Cordelia's entire future, the very survival of her family, felt suspended in that single, agonizing moment. She saw the conflict in his face, the rigid skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence of the locket she wore. He finally spoke, his voice regaining some of its controlled, icy timbre, but the raw edge remained. "Explain." It was not a request. It was a command. And Cordelia, seeing no other choice, began to speak. She led him away from the main path, towards a secluded stone bench hidden within an alcove of ivy, needing the support for her trembling legs. She sat, and he remained standing before her, an interrogator, a judge. "My father, John Ainsworth," she began, her voice low and trembling, "was not just a steward for the Marquess. He was a trusted friend. And my mother. She was a dear companion to your mother, the Duchess. They knew each other from childhood, from before their marriages elevated them to different stations. They maintained their friendship in private." She paused, gathering her courage. "Your mother knew my father was a man of impeccable honour. When the accusations were first levelled against him by Lord Harrington's father and his associates, she refused to believe them. She knew they were lying, that they were the true thieves, using my father as a scapegoat to cover their own depletions of the Marquess's estate." Alaric remained silent, his expression a mask of stone, but his eyes never left her face. "The Duchess tried to intervene," Cordelia continued, the memories painful and vivid. "She spoke to your father, the Duke. She spoke to the Marquess, but Harrington and his allies had already poisoned them against my father. They produced forged ledgers, paid for false testimony. They were powerful men, and my father was just one man. No one would listen." She reached up and finally drew the locket out from beneath her collar. The silver was warm against her skin. She held it in her palm, the worn metal a familiar comfort. "The night before my father was arrested, your mother came to our cottage. It was a secret visit. She was distraught. She told my mother that she had failed, that the men were too powerful, and even she could not make the Duke see the truth. She wept, and she gave my mother this locket." Cordelia looked up at Alaric, her own eyes now swimming with unshed tears. She said, "Take this. If the worst should happen, this will be my promise to you, a promise that I know the truth, and that one day I will find a way to make it right. It was a pledge, Your Grace, a guarantee of my father's innocence, from the only person of rank who believed him." "But she never did make it right," Alaric said, his voice flat. "No," Cordelia whispered. "A month later, both she and your father were killed in that terrible carriage accident, and with her, the only powerful voice on our side was silenced. My father was sent to prison. We lost everything, our home, our savings, our name. He died 6 months later, and my mother, she held on to this locket as the last shred of proof that her husband hadn't been a thief. She gave it to me on her deathbed." She finished her story, and a profound silence descended, deeper and more complete than any she had ever experienced. The garden, the house, the entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Cordelia sat, emotionally drained, the locket clutched in her hand, having laid the entire, wretched history of her family bare at the feet of the son of the woman who had tried to save them. Alaric did not move. He stood as still as the statues that lined the garden paths, his gaze fixed on the locket in her hand. The story she had told was an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of his world. His mother's secret friendship, her belief in a disgraced steward, the possibility that a great injustice had been committed and covered up. It all warred with the rigid, ordered reality he had constructed for himself. His coldness, she was beginning to realize, was not an absence of feeling. It was a shield, a fortress built around a heart that had been broken by the sudden, violent loss of his parents. He had coped by embracing logic, control, and ruthless efficiency, purging his life of messy, unpredictable emotions. And she, a simple companion, had just breached his walls and laid siege to his stronghold with a story of betrayal, honor, and a mother he now realized he may not have known at all. Slowly, as if moving through water, he reached out his hand. It was not a demand, but a quiet plea. "May I see it?" Her fingers trembled as she placed the silver locket into his large, outstretched palm. He closed his fingers around it, his knuckles white. He brought it up, his gaze intense, studying the faded engravings, the small, almost invisible clasp. He turned it over and, with a thumbnail, pressed a tiny, hidden catch at the base. The locket sprang open. Cordelia gasped. In all her years of owning it, she had never known it could open. She had assumed it was sealed by time and age. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, painted with exquisite detail. On one side was a beautiful, smiling woman with Alaric's piercing blue eyes, the late Duchess. On the other side was a handsome, kind-faced man with warm brown eyes and a familiar, gentle smile. It was a perfect likeness of her father, John Ainsworth. The sight of her father's face beside the Duchess's in the hidden compartment of the locket was irrefutable proof. Alaric stared at the miniature portraits, his stony composure finally cracking. The world he had meticulously controlled, the legacy he had fiercely protected, was all built upon a foundation of lies. This was not just a locket, it was a testament to a secret alliance that defied class and convention. "They were dear friends," Cordelia explained softly, her voice gaining strength with the evidence now in plain sight. "Your mother trusted my father implicitly. He was a man of great integrity, and she relied on his counsel for her private charitable works, the ones she kept separate from the Duke's estate. He was trying to protect her interests when he discovered the fraud being committed by Lord Harrington's father." Alaric's grip tightened on the locket. His coldness, his rigid self-control, was a fortress he had built around the grief of losing his parents. Now, he saw that the fortress had been a prison, locking him away from the truth. He understood his mother's agitation in her final weeks, her heated arguments with his father. She hadn't been foolishly sentimental. She had been fighting for an honest man. The carriage accident didn't just kill his parents. It silenced the truth, cementing the conspirator's victory. His entire life's work of upholding his family's honor suddenly felt like a bitter irony. "All these years," he said, his voice a low growl of dawning fury, "I have been preserving the honor of men who allowed this to happen." His gaze, now fractured with raw emotion, snapped to hers. "Why did you not tell me this sooner?" "How could I?" she countered, the memory of her fear still fresh. "Lord Harrington threatened me. He knew I was aware of the truth and warned me to stay away from you. He promised to see my family utterly destroyed if I dared to speak of the past." The mention of a direct threat against Cordelia solidified Alaric's rage into a cold, terrifying purpose. He finally understood the depth of her courage. Carrying this dangerous burden alone for so long, he rose from the bench, no longer just the Duke, but the instrument of a long-delayed promise. He looked at the portraits one last time before turning to Cordelia, his eyes blazing with a new fire. "The promise my mother made to your family did not die with her," he declared, his voice imbued with chilling certainty. "It now falls to me. Harrington and every man involved will face a reckoning. I will dismantle their lives, and I will restore the name of John Ainsworth." He met her gaze, no longer as a duke to a companion, but as an ally bound by a shared cause. "This is no longer your fight alone, Miss Ainsworth. It is now mine." The Winter Duke moved with the force of an avalanche. His reckoning came at the Duchess of Sutherland's grand ball. He made his entrance with Cordelia on his arm, her emerald gown a stark contrast to the black of his coat, silencing the entire assembly. He strode directly to a pale Lord Harrington. In the cavernous silence, Alaric revealed the locket, its open portraits a damning indictment. He spoke of the discovered ledgers and sworn confessions that proved the conspiracy against Cordelia's father. "It is over," Alaric stated, his voice a blade of ice, and with those words, Harrington's world collapsed. Before the stunned aristocracy, Alaric publicly restored the honor of the Ainsworth name, celebrating Cordelia's courage. He then led her away from the chaos, not to her modest lodgings, but to the warmth of a fire in his private salon at Blackwood Manor. "There," the formidable Duke confessed, his voice raw with an emotion no one had ever witnessed. "My coldness was a shield, Cordelia. You have shown me that honor and love are the greatest strengths. My life has been a long winter, and I am unwilling to let you go." He took her hand, his gaze intense. "Stay and bring the spring." Looking at the man who had torn down an empire for her, Cordelia's heart was full. "I will," she whispered, her own quiet promise sealing their future. And so, the story of the grey-gowned companion and the Winter Duke became a legend whispered in the very ballrooms that once scorned her. Theirs was not a simple romance, but a testament to the enduring power of truth and the quiet strength of a heart that refuses to be broken. It's a reminder that true nobility isn't found in a title or a bloodline, but in the courage to fight for what is right, and that sometimes the most profound love blossoms in the coldest of seasons, melting the ice around a heart that was only waiting for the right person to thaw it. The greatest revelations don't always happen under the glare of the chandeliers, but in the quiet moments where two souls recognize the truth in each other. If their journey from a chance collision to a life-altering love has touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates a story of justice and redemption. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss another story where hidden truths are brought to light and love conquers all. Thank you for listening.